The SUV screeched to a halt so suddenly that dust flew up and caked the windshield, but Karen didn't care. She slammed both fists onto the horn and held it down like it was a trigger for nuclear retaliation. My bull Duke didn't even blink. He just stared her down from the middle of the road, chewing slowly, his eyes squinting like he was judging her life choices. And then, to my absolute disbelief and growing delight, Duke sat down. Not laid down, sat. Right there on the gravel, in front of her luxury vehicle, like a Zen monk refusing to move. But that wasn't the craziest part. Within minutes, 5 other bulls came ambling from the pasture behind me, snorting and curious, forming a loose circle around her SUV like it was a campfire, and they were settling in for a story. The look on Karen's face was a cocktail of disbelief, rage, and something close to fear. She started yelling out the window, her sunglasses slipping off her nose. "Move your cows. I have an appointment. This is a road, not a barn," she shrieked. And that was the moment I knew I'd be telling this story for the rest of my life. Because not only was she wrong about everything, she was about to find out just how little power her HOA badge carried out here. I hadn't intended for my morning to start with a bull-based standoff, but when you live in open-range country, you learn to expect the unexpected. I'd just finished repairing a section of the northern fence and was walking Duke back toward the main pasture. He liked the walk, kept him calm and gave me a reason to stretch my legs. The sun was barely up, the air still crisp, and the only sound had been gravel crunching under my boots and the occasional grunt from Duke. That is, until Karen showed up in her bright white SUV like she was leading an urban conquest of the countryside. I didn't know who she was at first. Her windows were tinted, and all I saw was a woman in a blazer and what looked like pearl earrings, waving her arms and honking like her car was broken. When she rolled the window down, she barked something about calling the sheriff and trespassing charges. I told her, calmly, that this was a private ranch road, and she was already on our land. She waved a laminated badge at me and said, "I'm the president of the Woodside Hills Homeowners Association. I have jurisdiction here." Duke snorted at the same time I laughed. "There is no HOA jurisdiction here. The Woodside Hills development is a shiny new collection of mini-mansions 3 miles east, built just last year. They've got gates, rules, and fake grass yards. What they don't have is any legal control over the adjoining farmland, and definitely not over my great-grandfather's ranch that's been standing for nearly a century." Karen didn't take my laughter kindly. She threw open the door and stepped out in high heels, of all things, marching right toward me like she owned the gravel beneath her feet. "You think this is funny? You're blocking a public road with your animals. I could have you fined," she barked. I took a long breath and pointed to the rusted metal sign that clearly read, "Private Ranch Trail, No Through Traffic." She stared at it like it was in ancient Greek, then turned her attention to Duke. "Get that cow out of my way," she hissed. I shook my head and told her, "That's a bull, ma'am. A very proud and peaceful one. And he doesn't like loud noises or entitled energy." She looked like she was about to explode. Just then, my cousin Riley appeared on the fence line holding his phone up, clearly recording the whole thing. "We're gonna go viral for this," he whispered, barely hiding his grin. "It's like a protest but with livestock." Karen noticed him and shrieked again. "Stop filming me. This is harassment." But Riley just chuckled. "You're on private land, ma'am. You're the trespasser here." That's when it happened. She stomped back toward her car, yanked open the driver's side door, leaned on the horn again, and Duke responded by turning around, backing up slowly, and sitting directly in front of her bumper like he was parking himself for a picnic. It was majestic. It was petty. And it was perfect. The other bulls followed his lead like it was a silent cue. One of them circled behind her car and sat near the rear tires. Another stood near the side door, occasionally flicking his tail against the window. They weren't aggressive. They were curious. And, thanks to my new training technique, they were extremely obedient to Duke. I'd started training him using feed bells and visual targets as a hobby. I never expected it to pay off like this. Karen, now trapped in her own car by a wall of uninterested beef, had gone silent. Her fingers hovered over her phone, probably contemplating whether to call the sheriff or animal control or the Pope. I walked closer and said, "You can back up and go the long way around. Or wait. They'll move when they're good and ready." She snapped, "You think you can bully me with cows?" I replied, "They're bulls. And they don't respond to bullying. But they do sit real well when they're annoyed." Riley snorted so hard he nearly dropped the phone. Karen started dialing. "I'm calling the sheriff," she declared. I shrugged. "He's probably still at the diner. Want me to send him the video before or after breakfast?" She didn't answer. Just kept glaring at Duke, who blinked slowly and then let out a loud, dramatic grunt. He was loving the attention. As we stood there, the sound of incoming vehicles echoed from the ridge. A couple of Karen's fellow HOA members were arriving, one in a golf cart with a wood finish and another in a crossover packed with lawn signs. They must have been headed to one of their property line protests. Instead, they came over the hill and saw their fearless leader trapped in a bovine blockade, surrounded by 1,000-pound protesters sitting in perfect formation. One of them stopped and pulled out a phone, filming. Another waved but wisely kept her distance. Karen screamed, "Don't just stand there. Help me." No one moved. That was when I realized I didn't have to say or do anything else. Karen's ego had already boxed her in tighter than any fence ever could. The bulls didn't need to charge or moo or stomp. They just needed to exist. Calm, unmoving, unbothered. It was the perfect counter to her chaos. And from that moment I knew. This wasn't just a funny story. It was about to become legend. And Karen? She had no idea how deep into this rodeo she'd already stepped. The next morning, I found a plastic sleeve zip-tied to the corner post of my pasture gate. Inside was a letter printed on shiny paper with the Woodside Hills HOA emblem stamped across the top like it was a declaration of war. I didn't even need to read the whole thing to know who it was from. Karen had apparently gone home, brewed a pot of entitlement, and returned with legalese dripping from her keyboard. According to the letter, I was in gross violation of communal easement expectations by allowing livestock to obstruct an essential roadway used by local homeowners. She cited imaginary bylaws, referenced her right to enforce order, and demanded I remove all bulls from the shared route immediately. I leaned against the gate, stared at the letter for a long moment, and then pulled a red marker from my toolbox. Right on the backside of the letter, I scrawled in capital letters, "This is a private ranch road, Karen. Not your suburban driveway." I stapled it next to the original, just high enough for her to have to squint at it. Word had already gotten around town about the bull blockade. Riley's video had racked up tens of thousands of views overnight. People were posting memes of Duke sitting like royalty in front of her SUV. Someone even edited a tiny crown onto his head and dubbed him, "Sir Sits-a-Lot." I was amused, but I also knew Karen wasn't the kind to slink away quietly after public embarrassment. She was the type to double down, dig in, and go for round two. Sure enough, I didn't have to wait long. That afternoon, while I was brushing down Duke, a beige sedan pulled up just past the cattle guard. A man in a business suit got out, holding a clipboard and an uncertain smile. He introduced himself as Harold from the County Inspection Office. Apparently, someone had submitted a formal complaint alleging animal cruelty, obstruction of emergency routes, and unlicensed livestock training practices. Harold was polite and clearly aware he'd been sent on a wild goose chase, but protocol meant he had to inspect the property. I walked him through the pasture, showed him the feed schedule, the vet documentation, the water lines, and even Duke's training bells. He watched as Duke responded to my cue and sat down on command like a well-fed dog. Harold chuckled, scribbled a few notes, and said, "This bull's more disciplined than half the dogs I've seen in town." I offered him some lemonade and asked if he wanted to see the viral video. He declined, saying, "Already seen it twice." My wife follows the ranch hashtag now. She's obsessed with that bull. As he drove away, I noticed him shaking his head and laughing. Whatever damage Karen thought she could do with her complaint had already crumbled under the weight of common sense. Later that week, I started getting mail from HOA members. Not official letters, but handwritten notes. Some were surprisingly supportive. One neighbor wrote, "She doesn't speak for all of us. We love your bulls." Another simply said, "Duke 2024. But not all of them were friendly. One envelope had no return address and contained a single printed message: "Remove the bulls or we'll do it for you." I took that one to the sheriff, just in case. He sighed, read it, and said, "Sounds like someone's got too much free time and too little pasture." He added extra patrols near the ranch, not that I needed them. Out here, most trespassers don't get past the front gate once Duke gives them his signature glare. By then, the idea had already started forming in my mind. If Karen thought bulls were just mindless animals to be moved like traffic cones, maybe it was time to show her they could be the most peaceful protesters around. Using the training I'd already started with Duke, I began working with a few of the other bulls. Every time I rang a certain bell, they'd gather near me. Then I'd lead them to a marked spot and cue them to sit. It took patience and a lot of feed, but bulls are smarter than people give them credit for. Within a week, I had 5 of them sitting calmly in a circle on command. No aggression, no force, just steady, silent obedience. A few mornings later, I spotted Karen's SUV inching back down the same gravel road. This time I was ready. I stood beside the main path with the bell in my hand. As soon as she passed the gatepost, I rang it twice. Duke turned, trotted forward, and sat directly in her path. The others followed. One by one, they positioned themselves around her vehicle like the world's slowest synchronized dancers. Karen slammed the brakes and stepped out of the car, her face already red. "Are you doing this on purpose?" she shouted. I gave her the most neutral look I could muster. "I don't control where the bulls sit. They just like this spot." She stared at the bulls, then at me, then back at the bulls. "You're training them to harass me." I shrugged. "They just respond to sounds. Nothing illegal about that." Riley, of course, was already filming from the hayloft. That night, just before midnight, I heard the distinct sound of gravel crunching. I grabbed my flashlight and walked quietly to the front of the property. There they were, Karen and 2 men in polo shirts, standing near the edge of the road with a contractor who looked thoroughly uncomfortable. They had ropes, poles, and a metal gate lying in the back of their truck. Karen was barking instructions, trying to get the contractor to install the gate right where the ranch trail met the road. I stepped into the light and cleared my throat. "Evening, folks. You do realize this is my land, right?" The contractor froze. Karen wheeled around. "This road is a shared access route. I'm just protecting our homeowners." I pulled out the property line map and flashed the deed like a badge. "This entire stretch is private. Your development ends half a mile down the ridge. You're trespassing again." The contractor looked at her, then at me, then said, "I'm out," and walked back to his truck. Karen tried to bluster her way through the rest of the confrontation, but the sheriff showed up 10 minutes later, tipped off by Riley. After reviewing the footage and the property maps, he issued her a formal warning for trespassing and unauthorized construction. Karen huffed and cursed under her breath, but this time she didn't yell. She just stared at me with a smoldering hatred and muttered something about how I hadn't heard the last of her. I believed her, but I also knew something she didn't. Every move she made only added fuel to the fire. And now that fire was catching national attention, the bulls weren't just animals anymore. They were becoming a symbol. And Karen? She was about to learn that you don't win fights in the country by honking your horn. You win them by knowing when to stay seated. By the following week, Karen had gone from nuisance to full-blown rural antagonist. Whatever sliver of embarrassment she'd felt after the Bull Circle incident was now being smothered under layers of deflection, self-righteous fury, and desperate attempts to reclaim the illusion of authority. Her HOA cronies were now emboldened too, trying to act like enforcers, though none of them seemed to grasp the fact that their shiny laminated titles meant nothing outside their neighborhood gate. And yet, their efforts kept escalating. One morning, a man with a clipboard knocked on my door claiming to be from the HOA Compliance Extension Committee, trying to deliver another cease and desist letter. I didn't even open the screen door. I just pointed at the cattle trail behind him and said, "Wrong jurisdiction, wrong ranch, wrong guy." Then Duke wandered up behind me and let out a long, low grunt, sending the clipboard carrier running without another word. It wasn't enough for Karen to file complaints and try installing unauthorized gate. She wanted a show. She wanted to remind everyone in her HOA that she was in charge, even if it meant stepping out of bounds. And so she announced, with great theatrical flair, a surprise HOA Heritage Parade that would take place along the Ranch Trail Road, claiming it was part of Historical Community Access. She plastered flyers all over the HOA's bulletin board and even dropped one in my mailbox. The flyer was a masterpiece of delusion. A bright, smiling family under a banner reading, "Celebrating the land we all share." Except the land they wanted to parade through wasn't shared. It was mine. I called the sheriff the moment I saw the flyer. He sighed like he'd already received a dozen similar calls. "She didn't file for a county permit," he said. "She just declared it was happening. So we'll be there." I asked him if I should ring the bull bell. He chuckled and replied, "Let's see if they behave on their own first." The day of the parade came with the ridiculous flair of a bad sitcom. Karen arrived first in a golf cart covered in plastic flowers, waving to imaginary spectators like she was riding in a 4th of July procession. Behind her came a stream of HOA members in matching t-shirts, pushing strollers and pulling wagons filled with kids and tiny dogs. Some even carried balloons. They turned onto the trail with a giant banner held up between two aluminum poles reading "Woodside Hills, Heart of the Valley." It might have looked sweet to anyone unfamiliar with the history, but I stood at the pasture fence waiting for the moment their illusion ran face-first into reality. Duke was already watching. He stood at the edge of the fence line, snorting softly, flicking his ears back and forth. He knew something was off. As Karen and her parade of golf carts rolled closer to the narrow part of the trail, the sheriff's truck pulled in from the opposite direction. He stepped out slowly, hat tipped, and held up one hand. "Folks, I'm going to have to stop you there. This here's a private cattle route and you're trespassing without a permit." Karen didn't stop. She waved right past him and tried to drive around, ignoring his orders like she was above the law. That was all the confirmation the sheriff needed. He motioned toward his deputy, and they started turning people back, redirecting them to the neighborhood gate. Karen was fuming. She stepped out of the golf cart, stomped up to the sheriff, and yelled loud enough for everyone to hear, "You're obstructing a community celebration. This road belongs to everyone." The sheriff held up the property deed I'd provided days earlier. "Ma'am, this road's been on private ranch land since 1927. This ain't a public trail. You're not in HOA territory anymore." Her face twisted into something that barely resembled a smile, and she turned toward me. "You think this is funny?" she spat. I didn't say a word. I just gave Duke a small wave. He let out a loud huff and turned his back to her. The parade fell apart like wet tissue paper. Balloons were popped by thorns. A small dog escaped a wagon and chased a rooster into the brush. One of the golf carts ran out of battery halfway back up the hill. Karen sulked behind the last cart, arms crossed, glaring at me with all the hatred a woman in a sun hat could muster. It was petty, childish, and entirely her doing. But I knew she wasn't done. That kind of ego doesn't just dissolve. It calcifies into something more dangerous. Later that week, as I was unloading a new bale of hay from the trailer, I heard a commotion near the far side of the pasture. I jogged over and saw Karen's SUV parked halfway down the ranch road again. She was out of the car, arms flailing, yelling at something I couldn't see. As I got closer, I saw one of the younger calves, a sweet-tempered little guy named Benny, had wandered up to her, curious about her bag. He was nudging it with his nose, sniffing the fake leather strap. Instead of gently backing off, Karen turned and shoved him, hard, right in the shoulder. Benny stumbled, startled, and let out a confused bleat. Before I could even shout, Duke came barreling down from the pasture ridge, his hooves thunderous against the packed dirt. He didn't charge her, but he planted himself squarely between Karen and the calf, his head lowered in warning. Karen froze, her face pale and stunned. I walked up fast, placing a hand on Duke's shoulder to keep him calm. "You just shoved a calf," I said. "He was sniffing your bag and you shoved him." She stammered, tried to spin it around, claiming the calf was trying to bite her. I looked at her, then at the flattened grass behind her where she'd clearly tripped over her own tote bag, not the calf. "He's 5 months old," I said. "He's gentler than your HOA security guy with the clipboard." Karen turned, flustered, and tried to storm back to her car, but not before tripping over her own feet and landing directly in a patch of cactus. It wasn't serious, but it was enough to make her yelp and flail like she'd been struck by lightning. She pulled herself up, limping and fuming, and shouted that she was going to press charges for animal aggression. I replied calmly, "Go ahead. I've got 4 cameras on this side of the pasture. Want me to email you the footage?" She didn't answer. She just peeled out in reverse, leaving a dust trail in her wake. Back at the barn, I watched the footage with Riley. We were silent for a while, just watching Karen's entitled meltdown from 4 angles. Then Riley finally said, "You know what's funny? She keeps trying to be in control, but the more she pushes, the more she proves she has none." I nodded, petting Duke on the head. "And Duke doesn't even have to do anything. He just sits there and exists." That was the moment I realized something deeper. This wasn't just about bulls, fences, or road. It was about someone trying to impose their imagined authority on a place that had existed long before her and would exist long after. And no matter how many letters she printed or how many golf cart parades she threw, she couldn't outmaneuver a bull who knew when to sit and when to stand. It had gone beyond petty neighbor drama now. Karen was no longer just yelling from her window or stapling laughable warnings to fence posts. She was entering legal territory, not that she had the faintest idea how outmatched she was. A few days after the parade disaster and her run-in with Duke and Benny, I received a letter from a real law firm, an actual firm with a logo, watermark, and multiple pages that tried their hardest to sound intimidating. Karen had filed an official lawsuit against me for what she called the weaponization of livestock, unlawful obstruction of public access, and emotional distress caused by repeated encounters with aggressive bulls. She also claimed reputational damage within her community and mental anguish due to online harassment, none of which I or the bulls had anything to do with. But there it was, in ink. A lawsuit demanding damages of over $75,000 and the immediate removal of all bulls from roads and adjacent property. I laughed when I read it the first time. Not because it wasn't serious, legal action always carries weight, but because she was so wildly off base that it bordered on theatrical fiction. The idea that I had trained bulls as a tactical harassment unit was so outrageous, I half expected to see my name in the Guinness Book of Records next to a guy who trained parrots to do calculus. But laughing time was over. I called my lawyer, a no-nonsense woman named Julia who had handled ranch disputes for 2 decades. After one look at the paperwork, she smirked and said, she just sued herself into a corner. She didn't mean it lightly. Karen had filed false claims, submitted inaccurate property boundaries, and used HOA documentation to support demands on land completely outside their jurisdiction. Julia immediately drafted a countersuit, not just for harassment and trespassing, but for defamation, slander, and attempted unauthorized construction. It was a clean, airtight document, and she handed it to the clerk with the efficiency of a woman who'd seen dozens of suburban tyrants try this exact move and lose every time. Court was scheduled 2 weeks later in the county building, one of those low-ceiling rooms with beige walls and rows of squeaky chairs. Karen showed up dressed like she was going to a fundraising gala, in a blazer so stiff it could have stood up on its own. Her lawyer looked uncomfortable from the start, probably because he'd finally realized his client's case was built on ego and internet humiliation. On our side, Julia wore jeans, boots, and a plain blue button-down. I wore a flannel shirt, didn't shave, and brought a thumb drive labeled Bullcombe footage. As soon as the judge took her seat and reviewed the preliminary claims, she asked if there was video evidence. Julia nodded. We played the now viral video on the main screen, starting with Karen honking wildly at Duke and ending with her surrounded by bulls, screaming into the void. The courtroom tried to maintain composure, but you could hear stifled laughs. Even the judge had to pause before writing note. Karen's lawyer tried to reframe the video, calling it traumatic, a dangerous act of intimidation that humiliated his client. Julia countered with GPS records, property maps, historical documentation of the ranch road, and a printed transcript of Karen's public social media post in which she called the bulls lazy hamburger meat and mocked my family's intelligence. That didn't help her image. But the true death blow came when we played the nighttime footage of her trespassing with the metal gate. There she was on screen, barking orders at her cronies and trying to install hardware on private land while holding a flashlight in her mouth like a cartoon villain. The judge paused the video and looked directly at Karen. "Do you have any explanation for this footage?" Karen stammered, tried to blame the contractor, then insisted it was for safety. The judge leaned forward and said, "You were clearly warned this is private property. And yet you continued to interfere." By the end of the session, the judge dismissed Karen's claims entirely and gave her a formal warning for misuse of the legal process. But what surprised even me was what came next. The judge approved our countersuit and ordered her to pay restitution for legal costs, harassment, and trespassing damages. That included a fine, court fees, and a public apology letter. Karen's jaw dropped. Her lawyer looked like he wanted to melt into the floor. She stormed out of the courtroom without another word, but not before the local newspaper photographer captured her walking past a cardboard cutout someone had propped outside, Duke sitting with a plastic crown taped to his head. The photo made front-page news the next day with the headline, "The Bull Wins." Back at the ranch, life carried on as usual. Duke became a minor celebrity. I received messages from people all over the country asking about him, offering to send treats, and even requesting interviews for morning shows. I declined most of them. Duke wasn't a circus act, but I agreed to one local piece about livestock training and peaceful resistance, which turned out surprisingly well. A children's book author contacted me next, asking if she could write a story called Duke the Sitting Bull, which I approved under the condition that it taught respect for animals and included the lesson that yelling doesn't solve anything. One afternoon, as I refilled the troughs and Riley repaired a fence panel that a deer had flattened, we heard tires on gravel again. But this time, it wasn't Karen. It was a group of tourists from out of state, pulling off the road and asking if this was the ranch with the meditating bulls. I smiled, told them they could take pictures from outside the fence, and watched as they stood quietly, amazed, as Duke and the others gathered under the oak tree and sat together in the shade like old monks discussing philosophy. That evening, as the sun dipped low and bathed the field in gold, I stood at the edge of the road with a new sign in hand. I mounted it onto the fence post right next to where Karen's first HOA letter had once hung. This one was wooden, carved by a local artist, and it simply read, "Bulls may sit. Entitlement will not be tolerated." I took a step back and smiled. It wasn't a threat. It was a truth. Because out here, we didn't need horns to fight. We just needed patience, the land on our side, and a few good bulls who knew when to sit and when to stand. And Karen? She had gone silent for now. Her HOA position was under review, her lawyer had quietly resigned, and the neighborhood message board had mysteriously stopped working after someone posted a GIF of Duke every morning for a week straight. There were no more parades, no more honking fits, no more flyers. Just silence. Which, after everything, was the loudest victory of all. The weeks that followed were almost too quiet, as if the land itself was recovering from the storm of absurdity Karen had stirred up. For the first time in what felt like months, the only horns I heard came from Duke and the others as they bellowed toward the rising sun. There were no surprise processions down the trail, no HOA goons sneaking around at night, no clipboards or lettered threats. Karen had gone completely silent, and while part of me wanted to believe she'd learned her lesson, another part knew better. People like her didn't just disappear. They retreated to reload. But the silence wasn't empty. It was full of echoes, of public embarrassment, legal defeat, and the knowledge that her empire of laminated rules had crumbled against a wall of peaceful bulls and a rancher who refused to budge. The sheriff swung by one morning just to check in. He parked his truck by the fence and stepped out with a grin. He didn't even bother with small talk. He pointed toward the grazing bulls and said, "Still sitting like royalty." I nodded and handed him a thermos of coffee. We talked for a while, mostly about the uptick in rural property disputes since the nearby developments began expanding. He warned me that HOA types were getting more aggressive. Some of them really thought that by buying into a gated community, they'd inherited dominion over the entire zip code. I told him about the new sign I was working on, one that would go up near the trailhead where Karen had tried to hold her fake parade. It would read, "This land is fed by grass, not grievance." The idea of a protest through livestock had taken on a life of its own. Families would come by on weekends hoping to see the bulls sit. Kids would wave from behind the fence, sometimes holding signs that said things like, "Team Duke" or "SIT Power." Some even brought bells they rang gently, hoping to see the legendary bull formation in action. And while I didn't always oblige them, Duke deserved peace, not performance. Occasionally I'd let the bulls have their moment. They never disappointed. They sat like stone. And every time, people clapped as if it were a miracle. Maybe it was. A small reminder that calmness could be louder than fury. Then, out of nowhere, Karen re-emerged, not physically but through the media. A local columnist had run a feature on the bizarre feud between HOA leadership and a bull training ranch, using my story as a case study on the limits of suburban power. The piece was balanced, but Karen didn't see it that way. She posted a furious reply on her personal blog, which had been inactive for years. In it, she called me a rural manipulator, accused the county of favoritism, and insisted the bulls were part of a coordinated harassment campaign. She even claimed I was intentionally training them to sit in ways that spelled out insults when viewed from above. Riley nearly choked laughing when he read that part. "What's next?" he said. "Skywriting cows?" But the blog post backfired. It got picked up by a satirical website that reworded it into a parody article titled, "Woman Demands Bulls Stop Meditating on Her Street." Suddenly, the story was everywhere again. Memes resurfaced. People edited yoga mats under Duke. One clip went viral showing a bull blinking slowly over calm music with the caption, "When you've reached inner peace but Karen shows up with a clipboard." It should have been humiliating. Probably was. But instead of apologizing, Karen posted again, this time threatening legal action against internet bullying culture. That only made it worse. She became a symbol of exaggerated authority, the punchline in a national joke she couldn't escape. Around that same time, I was invited to a state agricultural expo to talk about livestock training and open-range law. I didn't plan on going at first, but Julia insisted. She said people needed to hear that rural landowners had rights too, and that stories like mine could help others who were being bullied by the creeping reach of suburban overreach. So I went. I brought Duke too. He rode in the trailer like a champion and walked onto the expo grounds like he owned them. The crowd loved him. Kids took pictures. One farmer from another county told me he'd used my story to win a dispute with a housing developer trying to block his cattle crossings. That meant more than any view count or meme. Back home, I noticed something strange one afternoon. Karen's house, visible from the eastern ridge if you stood high enough, had a for sale sign out front. I couldn't say for sure, but it looked like the same shiny white SUV was parked there less and less. Rumors floated in from neighbors who didn't like her much to begin with. Apparently, her position as HOA president had been reassessed, after members grew tired of being dragged into legal embarrassment. The new board wanted peace, not viral lawsuit. Karen had reportedly refused to step down, then finally relented after the county threatened to block any future HOA expansion if the harassment continued. I didn't gloat. I didn't post. I just walked out to the pasture, rang the bell once, and watched Duke settle into his favorite spot under the oak tree. A month later, the house was empty. Someone else moved in, a quiet couple from out of state who came by to introduce themselves and brought fresh-baked bread as a welcome. They said they'd heard about the whole saga but promised they had no interest in HOA drama. They even laughed when their toddler pointed at Duke and yelled, "Big puppy!" We got along fine. That evening, I walked the length of the trail one last time to remove the final remnants of Karen's old signs. One flimsy plastic warning was still zip-tied to a tree, half faded from the sun. I cut it loose, rolled it up, and tossed it in the scrap pile. There was no ceremony, no audience. Just the sound of wind through the grass and the distant lowing of bulls who had never cared about power struggles or parades. As the sun sank low and cast golden rays across the field, I stood by the new carved sign we'd mounted a few days earlier. The wood was smooth, the letters deep and proud. It read, "Where Bulls Sit Peace Wins." I ran my hand along it and smiled, not because I'd won some petty battle, but because the land had stayed true. The ranch hadn't changed. The bulls hadn't changed. But everything else had shifted around them. Karen came in honking like she could move mountains with noise. But in the end, it wasn't noise that held the ground. It was patience, stillness, and one very stubborn bull with a gift for ignoring fools. And now, when people drove by and rang the bell, it wasn't about protest or spectacle. It was a small ritual of respect, a nod to the story, to the land, to the quiet power that comes not from shouting, but from sitting when it matters most.